Hey, I'm Thomas from Lightning Boy Studio. In today's video, we're going to talk about how to make your own Toon shaded character in Blender. We're going to share our own process, our workflow, and our techniques, and hopefully those work out for you as well. So our goal here is to try to put as much info as possible in one single video so that this can be sort of our standalone guide that you can always refer to if you're ever stuck in your own creative process. So we'll cover modeling, UV unfolding, and texturing. Of course, we're going to speed up the process quite a bit. This won't be real time because building one of our characters usually takes us several days. Also, we'd like to thank everyone that bought Lightning Boy Shader 2.0, which we launched at the end of 2020. It really helps us a lot and supports the channel and helps us work on our own personal project called Dinomancers. So for those of you who have bought this shader, we'll share a lot of techniques on how to apply it on your character in this video. Alright, that's enough talking for now. Let's open Blender and let's get started. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Most of the time when you're gonna model something, you'll want some sort of concept art to help you get started. It doesn't need to be something super fancy, but our own personal philosophy is we like to find one or two things that can make our character iconic and focus on those. Once we know what we want our characters to look like, we usually draw them in a T-pose from both front view and side view. These drawings are really useful, especially at the beginning of the modeling process to get started right. That way you know you'll have the right proportions and it should really help you get started. One of the nice things about our character designs is that they are pretty simple overall, so we don't need fancy ZBrush sculpting or anything like that. In our case, we simply model them polygon by polygon directly in Blender. So usually the way we proceed is we start by creating a simple plane, which is basically a polygon, and then we add a mirror modifier. That way we can simply work on one half of the character and the other half gets created at the same time. You'll also notice that one of the options of the mirror modifier is called clipping. It's to make sure that you can't bring your vertices on the other side of your character by mistake. If the mirror modifier doesn't seem to be working, it's probably because you moved the plane in object mode, which means its origin is still in the middle of the plane. To fix this, you make sure to always work in edit mode and to be sure that the origin of your object is at the center of the world. Now let's talk about the modeling process. First, you need to select the object you want to work on, and then you need to switch into edit mode to actually adjust the geometry. To do that, you either press Tab or you select it in the upper left corner of your viewport. Now that you're in edit mode, you can modify your geometry by using either vertices, edges, or faces. So in this case, I'll select edge mode, click one of the edges here, and hit E to extrude that edge. That way you can model by creating more and more faces. It's good practice to keep modeling in quads, meaning that you want 4 sides on each of your polygon as much as possible. You will get better results when adding subdivisions later on. But it's also okay to use triangles here and there if you have no choice. To bridge gaps, you can select both edges and press F to fill. You can also merge vertices by pressing M. The knife tool can also be really useful to add new lines exactly where you need them. Just click where you want to add new vertices and it's going to add them automatically. The loop cut will let you add new edge loops. This can be really useful when you need to add more topology around the elbow or knee area, for instance, because you need those areas to have enough resolution for them to bend properly. Most of these options can be accessed by right-clicking in edit mode, or you can find them in the toolbar on the left side of your screen. There are a lot of selection shortcuts that can save you a lot of time in Blender. So remember when I showed you the different selection modes here, they each have specific shortcuts. In edge selection mode, you can alt-click on an edge to select the whole edge loop. In face selection mode, you can alt-click on an edge of the face to select an entire row of faces. In any of those modes, you can also control-click on 2 edges or faces to select everything in between along the shortest path. In any of those modes, if you hit L while your mouse is above a specific part of your character, you will select every pieces of geometry linked to that area. It's an easy way to select different pieces of your character that are linked together. You can also hit L many times in a row to add them to your overall selection. Once you have something basic modeled, you might realize that the proportions are still slightly off, even though you have your T-pose drawing to help. When that happens, the proportional editing tool can be a great way to adjust your geometry. click on the target looking icon at the top of your screen. Then when you're in grab mode, which you can activate by pressing G, you'll see that a circle appears around your mouse. That's your area of influence. Instead of moving single vertices, you'll now be able to move stuff around using a soft selection gradient. You can increase or reduce the influence using your mouse wheel. If you have many unconnected parts on the same object, such as clothes, hair, or accessories, and you don't want to move them, you can activate Connected Only. Only move vertices that are already connected. It's pretty common to use a Subdivision modifier on a character mesh. This modifier allows to add more geometry to your character, which makes it look more HD, more round, and can get rid of shadow artifacts. The good thing with this modifier too is that you can easily toggle it on and off, so you can still model with your lower res version, which is much easier to tweak. However, this tends to round off many of the sharp edges that sometimes help give your model more of a stylized look. To fix this, you can manually raise the crease value of certain edges to keep them sharp at all times. This option can be accessed by pressing N and clicking on Item, and then under Edge Data, you'll find something called Crease. For example, this helmet looks pretty bad when we apply the Subdivision modifier by default. But once we give certain edges a crease value of 1, we're able to give a nice rounded surface around the helmet while keeping other edges sharp where they need to be. You can also achieve this by adding a small bevel on your edges instead. But since we're doing a simple stylized character, the crease value is much faster and will get you pretty much the same result. As you'll see later in this tutorial, we use the Solidify modifier to generate outlines, but it can also be very useful for adding thickness to clothes. Look at this cape, for example. If you wanted to have more thickness, you might be tempted to model it by extruding the faces, but then it'll be way harder to modify and rig. By simply adding a Solidify modifier, you can keep the thickness constant and non-destructive. Same for these Dinomancer's belt straps, which are extremely simple and easy to model this way. But what can you do when you only want the Solidify modifier to affect certain pieces of your mesh? Let's say, for example, that you combined this character's cape with his shirt, and you don't want the shirt to have a thickness like this. In that case, you can just go in the Vertex Group options and click on this plus button here. Create a new group and name it however you want. Go in Edit mode and select the faces that you want to be part of this group. Then you click on Assign, and there you go. The Solidify modifier will now only affect these faces. Modeling a character's face is always very challenging, and even when working on a Toon shaded character, it's no different. Your modeling style can vary a lot depending on the style you're going for. In our case, we quickly realized that the more details we modeled in 3D, like 3D lips or 3D eyelids, the more we would get artifacts and weird edges with our Toon shading. On top of that, because of the cartoony look of our characters, we knew we wanted to deform the faces as needed, and that in some case, we would want to deform them quite a lot. So for that reason, we decided that the facial rig would be completely separated from the character's face mesh. As you can see, the mouth is closed. We are only using a thin painted line of geometry, which gives a great 2D feel. And when we want the mouth to open, we use a boolean to carve out a mouth interior. Same thing for the eyes, which are completely separated from the face. We'll explain how to do a facial rig in another video. It can be a very complex setup, and it's worth an entire tutorial in itself. But we just wanted to let you know that it's totally possible to not model lips, eyelids, and all those details as part of the face mesh itself. So this concludes the main steps of our modeling process. If you're still using the Mirror Modifier at this stage, you'll want to apply it so that it becomes real geometry. Of course, feel free to model however you prefer. Some people like to sculpt their model and retopologize after, which is great too. This is just our own approach for these types of models. Now, you'll want to start applying colors and textures and more complex shading. This is where materials come in, and where people sometimes get lost and have trouble getting things to look good. There are a couple of ways to approach this step. If you're not afraid of technical stuff and would like to really understand how to build shaders, you could watch our previous tutorial series, which will teach you how to build a Toon shader node by node. For this particular character guide, however, we're going to show you how to use the Lightning Boy Shader 2.0. which was inspired by the same Toon shader series, but rebuilt from the ground up to be more versatile and intuitive for artists. The problem when you make your own Toon shader in general is that they are often built for a specific style in particular, and if you want to change any aspect of it, you have to dig deep inside of your node trees to tweak specific details, which can take a lot of time and effort. We'll show you how easy it is to set up a full character using our system, and if you like it, you can buy it on our Gumroad page. This is what it looks like when you open the Lightning Boy Shader 2.0 blend file. First thing I'm going to do is change the rendering mode to rendered, then delete the sphere in the middle. By default in this scene, you'll also see many lights and spheres. Don't worry about these for now. We'll talk about it later when we explain how to link your materials to specific lights using our feature library. So let's get started. We're going to append our character to this scene. If you don't know, append is the equivalent of importing in Blender. So we will import the character we made into this scene. We like to apply outlines on our characters. Luckily, the Lightning Boy Shader 2.0 comes with an easy preset for it. To apply an outline, find the Solidify outline object, use Shift-D to duplicate it, and drag it in the same collection as your character model. Then, selecting your object first and the Solidify outline second, you can press Ctrl-J to join them. If you have multiple objects, you'll need to repeat that step a couple of times. You might also have to play with the Mirror modifier's thickness and offset for things to look right in certain cases. Sometimes you might need to actually change your geometry in edit mode to fix specific interpenetration, like on the helmet here. And sometimes you might want to remove the outline altogether in certain areas, for example, on this sleeve. To do that, select the edges you want to exclude in edit mode, then assign them to a vertex group named Solidify, which should have been created automatically when you joined the Solidify outline object to your mesh earlier. You might have to invert the vertex group influence in the Solidify modifier for this to work properly. So now that we got an outline, we're going to make a simple gray material to establish the shading style. Let's look at our concept again. As you can see, the shading is mostly sharp if you take a look at the hand or the boot. We've got some basic textures applied with scratches on the torso and what feels like soft occlusion, which adds darker shadows and makes it look more real. Finally, we got a strong Rimlight coming from the right to separate the character from the background. Let's see if we can reproduce all of this in 3D. So now back to our scene, we're going to apply the base Lightning Boy Shader material to our character. First, select your geometry in object mode and then apply the LBS material on each parts of your character. Now let's open the shader editor and look at what the base Lightning Boy Shader material looks like. We've got a color feature node, which will be useful to apply a color, a Keylight node for illumination, and a Specular. We're going to remove the Specular node for the time being. One thing that you need to know about the Lightning Boy Shader 2.0 is how to add or remove layers. As you can see with the base Lightning Boy Shader material, it comes with only 3 layers. But what happens if you want more or less? You can always click on this icon here and it'll give you a lot of options for how many layers your material can have. You can go up to 12, so you can be really creative with how you customize your shader. It's really easy to add or remove layers as you go along, so feel free to adjust this however you need. Okay, now back to our character. Let's adjust the Keylight and make it sharper by dropping the softness to 0 and increase the range a little bit. Now, the only thing we seem to be missing is Occlusion and a Rimlight. To add new features, you're going to need to pick them in the Lightning Boy Shader library. So let's click on it in the outliner and open the shader editor. The Lightning Boy Shader library contains all the nodes that you can use with the Lightning Boy Shader 2.0. So anytime you need a new node, you can always open this and grab whatever node you need and copy it over to the material you're working on. So in this case, we're going to grab an Ambient Occlusion feature, a 2D outline feature, and the blue Keylight from the extra selection, which is perfectly suited for special effects like Rimlights. Press Ctrl-C to copy them, and let's paste them into our material. Let's start by hooking up the Ambient Occlusion. We'll connect it in layer 3. For it to work, you'll also need to make sure that Ambient Occlusion is enabled in the render properties. Okay, so with that done, you'll see that you have occlusion appearing on your model, and you can control the range and softness in the settings on the right. A cool thing would be for the occlusion to only appear in the shadowed area, which would be more realistic. But right now, it appears everywhere. So let's see. There's a couple of ways you can do this. But what we're going to do here is duplicate our Keylight and change the invert values to 1. We're then going to connect the 2 gray circles together. If you reveal the nodes by clicking on these arrows, you'll see that what we just did is connect the Keylight's mask to the occlusion's opacity. And there you have it. The occlusion only appears in shadowed areas. Masking is really useful, and one of the things that's extremely easy to do with the Lightning Boy Shader 2.0 system. Because of how the features are used as separate layers, anything can be masked, and anything can be used as a mask too, just like in Photoshop. It's actually very important to understand this concept in order to get creative with this shader. So let us quickly demonstrate how this works. We're going to look at what this mask output looks like by connecting it directly in the material output. So you see how we get a pure black and white color? When you invert it, the colors switch back and forth. So what it means to use a mask like this is that everywhere where you see white, your node will take effect, and everywhere where you see black, your node won't be applied at all. You can also duplicate these nodes and use them on the material of your floor. That way your floor will also have ambient occlusion, and you'll have all the same settings that you can use on your character. Okay, now it's time to add the Rimlight that we're still missing. We're going to add a new layer by clicking on this selection here, which says 3 Lightning Boy Shader, and change it to 4. Then we're going to connect the 2D outline in layer 4 and change it to a white color. Now you see that we have what looks like a 2D light appearing all around our character, like a Fresnel effect. What we're going to do is restrict it to our Keylight B by connecting it in this L-shaped input. When it's done, we'll be able to use the influence value to change the size of the outline. Cool! As you can see, we can now rotate the light around, and it's going to cast shadows like a real light. But it will only ever appear at the edge of our character, no matter what angle we look at. At this point, you might still be a little confused why we keep referring to our lights as red, blue, and green, or RGB keylights. The reason we name our lights based on colors like RG or B is that this is the way light linking is achieved with the Lightning Boy shader. As you see, if you click in each of these main lights, they each cast one of the pure primary color in the light properties on the right. Now, as long as you use a node from the Lightning Boy shader library, you will never actually see those colors appear in the scene. There is color filtering happening under the hood, which means that if you use nodes from the character section here, which is labeled as red, it will isolate everything but the lights casting red colors in your scene. If you use nodes from the background section, labeled green, only the green casting lights will affect it, and so forth. By default, the Lightning Boy shader material is set up to use the Keylight R, which we recommend to use on characters. The ground uses the green Keylight, which leaves the blue Keylight to create special effects like Rimlights. A side effect of this is, of course, if you use the Lightning Boy shader on your character, you should use it everywhere in your scene, since other materials will receive these red, green, or blue lights, and you don't want that. But the Lightning Boy shader is very versatile and can easily be used to create the materials for your environment. Now would be a great time to start applying some basic colors. To do that, we'll need more materials. Let's click on this plus button a couple more times. Choose the Lightning Boy shader material for each one and make them all unique copies by clicking on this number on the right. That way we'll be able to edit each one independently. You can rename them as well. So maybe you'll want one for the skin, one for the clothes, another one for the belt, and so on. Then what you need to do is apply the material to the correct geometry by going in edit mode with tab, selecting the desired geometry with L, and clicking assign. At this point, your Solidify outline will probably start to look weird. That's because in the Solidify modifier settings, we tell it to look at the previous material to set the color of the outline. You see this number -1? That means that it's looking for the material before. So if you apply the skin material to your character's arm, the outline of the arm will take the color of the material above it, which is black in this instance. To fix this, make sure to insert a Solidify outline material above each of your surface material. You can leave them all black for now, But if you want, you can also make them unique copies, so that the outline for the skin is a lighter brown, for example, or use a dark red for the outline of the shirt. So now it's time to add a basic color on your character. Let's say we take this red shirt here. We need to assign 2 colors with this current setup. A color for the dark part of the shirt, so a dark red, and a color for the lit part of the shirt, which would be a brighter red. You can do this for every materials of your character. Okay, so now we see what our character looks like with some basic colors applied. We're getting closer, but our character could definitely use some more painted details. To do this, we'll need to make sure our character is properly unwrapped, or in other words, that it has UVs. If you're new to the concept of unwrapping your geometry, think of it like this. Imagine that your 3D character is made of cardboard. You're basically unfolding every piece of your character so that it becomes a flat surface. And from there, you can easily paint details on it. So to do that, we're going to need to make some cut lines. To do the same thing on this red shirt, we'll first have to define cuts. Go back into Edit mode and select the desired edges. Then press U to access the UV mapping options. And click on Mark Seam. The edges will turn red, so you know these ones are marked. When you've marked all the seams that you want, you can unwrap the faces by pressing U again and clicking Unwrap. You can see the result by extending the timeline window and changing it to the UV editor. What you want to look for is to minimize stretch and not have pieces overlap each other. You want to make cuts where they will be less visible on your character, like under their armpits, inside the legs, and in between the fingers. Also, keep in mind that you don't have to get it right on the first try. It's okay to do quick unwraps to test things out. And if it's not working, you can always go back, mark more seams and remove some, and press unwrap again. If you have multiple geometry pieces sharing the same material, it's possible that they overlap. To fix this, you can go to UV, Pack Islands, and Blender will reorganize all the selected UVs for you. Great, so now that we have UVs, we're ready to paint textures. The way we painted all our textures for this project was by using black and white masks. It might sound like a weird idea at first. You're probably much more used to seeing full color textures like this one. These were painted in Photoshop during our earlier tests a few years ago. While the Photoshop brushes are nice and more intuitive, it can be difficult to see what you're doing. So here's what's cool about black and white masks. You can see the result directly in Blender in real time with the final shading, unlike if you were painting in, let's say, Substance Painter. Here's how it works. First, we'll need a color node, so let's go back to the material library and let's pick this color node here and copy paste it on this skin material. Now we can create a new image texture using Shift A, then selecting Image Texture. You can rename it however you like. We'll call this one Skin Mask. We'll use a 4K texture for this one and connect it in the Alpha Mask input here. That means it is now being used as a mask controlling this color. Now if you go in the top left menu, you can switch to Texture Paint and then press N to access the tool menu on the right. You'll see your newly created texture here at the top. If you go in Brush Settings and then Color Picker, by default, you should have white as the primary color and black as the second. So if you remember how we explained the mask earlier, wherever you will paint white is where your node will appear. And if you hit Control and then Paint, you will actually be painting black, which means your node won't take effect in that area. The way we personally work is by setting the stroke method to line and change the fall off to constant, which gives us very nice sharp edges. Let's paint some lines on the fingers to add some details. So here we're drawing using the line stroke method and then erasing by holding Control so that we can get those thinner strokes. As you can see, if I switch back to the shader editor, I can adjust the color of what I painted and change the opacity using this slider. This is why we love this technique. You just concentrate on painting the shapes, but you still have full control over the opacity and color afterwards. While painting, there are a few options that can be really useful. First, symmetry. You can find it by pressing N under the tool setting when you're in texture paint mode. Click on the right axis. In our case here it's X, but depending on how you modeled your character, it might be another one. And then you can paint symmetrical patterns on each side. For example, if you use this technique, you can paint the details on the fingers only once, and they will also be updated on the other side. Also, if you select geometry in edit mode, you can click these two squares in the upper left of your screen to only be able to paint on the selected faces. One thing you can do with this is select some faces, then use a very large brush with a soft fall off to create a fading effect without affecting your other paint strokes. The cool thing about this technique is that you don't have to stop at one color and one texture. If you look at this shirt, for example, we use a 3 color node, which means that we can set up to 3 colors, each with their own mask, within the same node. The bottom color doesn't need any mask because it's the underlying color. But we're using 2 other black and white masks to drive these color here, which we can always change whenever we want. Once you start creating textures with several colors, you'll likely find it very useful to use the color adjustment node. So here's how it works. You can just grab your color adjustment node and bring it over to your shader. Then let's take the colors that we set before and limit them to the Keylight area. We can then use that same color node, but hook it in the color adjustment node. Now we can adjust the colors in the color adjustment node, and it'll affect all 3 colors that we set before. So in this case, we'll use the color adjustment node to darken this red shirt. But notice how the parts lit by the Keylight remain the same because they're hooked in the layer above it. Now it's time to dive deeper and have fun fine-tuning each material to our liking. Let's look at this belt, which is metallic, unlike the shirt. This material is using very similar nodes, except we added a specular to make it look shiny, and a duplicate of that same specular underneath with softer values, so that it looks like some sort of glow. If you duplicate multiple nodes like this, it can be easier to rename them for clarity. You can do it by selecting the node and pressing N. However, when you do so, make sure to change the name of the label and not the node group itself. Otherwise, all the specular nodes in your scene will share this new name instead of just this single node. Another really cool node is the Matcap node. We personally don't use this one on every metallic surface, but it's very good for fake reflections. For example, let's look at this metal ball. We use the same double specular node we showed earlier and the color node to make scratches, but we also use a Matcap node. What it does is use a simple Matcap image texture and project it on top of the surface based on the normals. So even if we were to stretch the surface of the ball, you see that the reflection still follows, and you can easily adjust the texture of this Matcap yourself in Photoshop, or even make your own Matcaps. To change the Matcap texture, all you have to do is make the node group unique by clicking on this number, and here we're just going to give it a unique name so we know what this is. Then press Tab with the Matcap node selected, and inside you'll be able to edit the texture path. You can get very different results depending on the Matcap you're using, so have fun experimenting with that. Once you understand what all these nodes do, and a good way for that would be to read through the user guide that comes with the Lightning Boy Shader 2.0, there's really no limit to what you can do with this shader, especially once you understand the power of masking. For example, take the face of Ballista here. We didn't like how the light interacted with his face. No problem. We simply made a black and white texture and use it to mask over the opacity of the Keylight. Now, we can paint where the light is transparent, giving us much more control over the look of the character. And we didn't just do this on his face. We used this in multiple places, like under the belt and on the boots and so on. So that way, these areas will always have this nice little shadow, regardless of how we light the scene. One material that is always tricky to get right on a Toon shaded character is the hair. If you want to keep the look very flat looking, then it's not a problem. But if you want to add details and make it look slightly more realistic, you can add a specular feature from the library. Now by default, it'll probably look kind of metallic, which is not right. That's because in real life, hair tend to have very long specular instead of a circle like this. This is the result of tens of thousands of hair that you'll find on someone's head. Since we're doing a stylized character, we don't want to add all those individual hair, but we can fake it using a pre-built style that comes with the Lightning Boy Shader 2.0. So what we're going to do is go to the Lightning Boy Shader library and under Styles, find the Anisotropic style, copy-paste it into your material. Then we're going to drag and drop it between the specular and the Lightning Boy shader. That's going to use the original specular shape and make some modifications to it. It's normal if you don't see anything different at first. In our case, we need to adjust the general offset because the specular is hidden inside the helmet. You also want to check your UVs because they need to be unfolded a specific way for the style to work correctly. In short, you want your unwrapped UVs to flow vertically. As you can see, if you rotate the hair in the UV editor, the specular is going to rotate as well. You can also move the UVs to position the specular exactly where you want it. Next, we're going to add some details to it. We're going to increase the stripes and repeat values to create some negative space, and then play with the deform and complexity values to create more of a wavy shape. At any time, you can open the original specular options and change the color. Generally, you'll want to make sure that the specular has quite a large range, otherwise the effect will be hard to see. To give a more organic look to your lights, you can use what we call a painterly style. Go to the Lightning Boy shader library, pick any of these painterly styles features, and, like with the Anisotropic specular, drag and drop it on the line connecting a layer to the Lightning Boy shader. For example, you could use it on this Keylight, which will add a grungy texture to all the gray transition areas of the light mask. This can be useful when you have a very close-up shot and you want to break it up to look a little less perfect and 3D. Earlier, we've shown how to use the SS Occlusion, which is the real-time occlusion you get from EEVEE, but you can also use baked occlusion, and we even have a special node for it, which lets you change the softness and range easily. If you're confused about the difference between these two occlusion types, it goes like this. Ambient Occlusion SS is a simplified version of occlusion. It's the simplest to set up because it works kind of automatically as soon as you activate the occlusion in your scene. Baked occlusion requires an extra step. You need to bake occlusion on your character yourself and export it as a texture. Baked occlusion can be more precise and might catch some extra details that Occlusion SS might not get. You can combine the two occlusions technique on a single character if you want, since they both have their pros and cons. One thing you'll notice is that you can quickly end up with a lot of materials, and it can be difficult to adjust everything at once. For example, let's say I wanted to change the Rimlight color. It can be tedious to change it on every single material of the character. This is something we planned for with the Lightning Boy Shader 2.0. If you notice that a node has an asterisk next to its name, it means you can access additional options by clicking on it and pressing Tab. The relevant nodes will always be very apparent in an orange box. So if you want to change the color of the Rimlight globally in the scene, you can change the opacity and the color from here. Another thing you can do is use what we call a scene adjustment. We like to use one as the last layer on every material. By default, it does nothing, so it might seem useless at first. But if you add one on every of your materials, you can press Tab and darken all the materials at once, which can be really useful if you're animating a complex shot and need to tweak lighting, or if your shot is taking place during night. Here's an example of a dark scene that would be lit by a purple light. As you can see, we're using the scene adjustment layer to darken our character and tint him to the right color. But if you noticed before, we hooked the scene adjustment underneath the Rimlight. That means that although we're affecting all the colors of our character at once, the Rimlight will remain unaffected. So this was our overview of how we model our characters and use the Lightning Boy Shader 2.0 to give them this Toon shaded look. We tried to cover as much as we could, so sorry if it felt a bit rushed at times. There is still so much more to cover about the Lightning Boy Shader 2.0, but we couldn't fit it all in a single video like this. We will share more tips in future videos for sure, and if you want, you can also follow our Twitter page where we show various tricks via highlight videos. Alright, that was a lot of information. Hopefully some of it was useful for you. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you like this tutorial and you want to see our next ones, be sure to subscribe to our channel. And if some of these techniques were helpful for you to make your own character, please share your work with us. You can tag us on Twitter, and we always love to see what you're working on. So I guess that's it for today's video. Until next time, take care and have fun creating.